14 first-hand stories about residential. How residential schools tried to get rid of indigenous cultures. The Truth and Reconciliation final report calls for Canadian schools to develop, implement curricula aimed at teaching indigenous languages and cultures, particularly the history and legacy of residential schools. December 16, 2015. It said the best way to avoid repeating history is by learning history. Yet even today, few Canadians seem to know the full and truthful extent of the country's Indian residential schools. That's one reason the Truth and Reconciliation final report released today, Tuesday, calls for Canadian schools to develop and implement curricula aimed at teaching Indigenous languages and cultures, particularly the history and legacy of residential schools. Thanks to the Commission's work, the violent abuse of residential school survivors is now well documented. But some still refuse to acknowledge the residential school program's role in a larger strategy of suppressing and assimilating Indigenous languages and cultures, what the Commission explicitly calls an attempt at cultural genocide. This despite Duncan Campbell Scott, architect of the residential school program, describing his own goals trying to get rid of the Indian problem by continuing until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic. Here are 14 stories from survivors included in the Truth and Reconciliation final report, underlining how the residential schools attempted to erase the identities of Indigenous students. This here is a residential school. See the British flag. Rachel Kakashem remembers the first thing that happened to her on her first day at a residential school was to remold her image. I remember how they took our clothes, the clothes that we wore when we left, and they also cut our hair. We had short hair from there on, and they put a chemical on our hair, which was some kind of a white powder. Lydia Ross remembers how administrative numbers were used on a daily basis instead of names. My name was Lydia. But in the school I didn't have a name, I had a number. I had a number 51, number 44, number 32, number 16, number 11, and then finally number 1 when I was just about coming to high school. So I didn't have a name, I had numbers. The residential school also broke family bonds. Daniel Nanook remembers being separated from his siblings. So even though I was there with my sister and I only seen her about 4 times in that year, and we're in some building in the same mission. They had a fence in the playground. Nobody was allowed near the fence. The boys played on this side. The girls played on the other side. Nobody was allowed to go to that fence there and talk to the girls through the fence or whatever. You can't. Beverly Ann Michelle remembers even after 2 of the brothers committed suicide at school, she wasn't allowed to talk to her sister. I wasn't even allowed to talk to my brothers, and I had 3 brothers there. 2 of those brothers committed suicide, and it really hurt not to be able to, and I couldn't even talk to my sister. Here they are here. Madeline John Stout reflects that the residential schools left a sense of separation in survivors. There was a sense of separation in the sense of not connecting to your own. You know, the people who would mean the most to you, your family, your members, and your community members, a complete separation. Many survivors arrived at school speaking Indigenous languages, usually with no understanding of English or French, and students were punished if they spoke their own languages, as Marcel Gaubage remembers. A sister, a nun, started talking to me in English and French and yelling at me. I did not speak English and didn't understand what she was asking. She got very upset and started hitting me all over my body. hands, legs, and back. I began to cry, yell, and become very scared. And this infuriated her more. She got a black strap and hit me some more. Fred Kistebish remembers the school's religious teachings and confusing, traumatizing. I don't understand the religious teachings of the priest and the nuns. There was a big blackboard that says if you're a good boy, you'll go to heaven. On the other side of the drawing, there's if you commit mortal sins, this is where you're going to go, and then you have Lucifer in hell. And it said always, always, forever, forever. That's traumatizing for a 12-year-old or a 15-year-old or a 14-year-old. Anyways, when I left the residential school, I knew that if I died, for sure I was going straight to hell because I was disobedient, because there are things lacking in my childhood. Jeanette Bizet Laloche remembers what happened when she rejected a priest's distorted lesson about her own language and culture. They gave us a lesson on the Pentecost, and then the principal father came with the inspector. You had to be good You had to be a good in you person, and you had to have good posture. Then they explained to us the Pentecost, and he said the apostles had tongues of fire on the top of the head, and they started speaking all language. And there I said, no, they didn't speak my language. Then there he insisted. He said, yes, Danette, they spoke your language. I said, no, it is impossible that they could have spoken my language, because I began to be a rebel then. The God that my grandmother taught me about, my grandparents taught me, he was nothing like theirs. Then there I said, no, they didn't speak my language. We didn't have a word to say, and I remember what he said. Put your hand on the desk. He couldn't contradict it, and I placed my hand on the desk, and with the ruler I had to repeat that the apostles spoke my language. Me, it took time before I said it. But that's it. I was marked. I was hit with the ruler. There was a blade on the end of the ruler. The nun there cut their hair. Wow. As Hazel Iwachuk remembers, violence was used daily to enforce the orders. We were ordered around like we were already big girls. We had to take the orders no matter what. You couldn't say, I can't do that. You did it, or else you got strapping. And we had Bible study every night. I didn't mind that. I thought, what are they preaching here about love? Where's that love, There was no love for us. They made a liar out of Bibles and liars out of themselves, too. And as Juliana Alexander remembers, the school's demands of moral perfection from students were often in jarring contrast to the violence of those running the schools. They were trying to tell me that this church or this place we are in, I had to be this perfect person or whatever. And yet at the same time, that's not what I saw, because I thought to myself, well, if you're a priest and nun, how come you're doing this to this child, or you're doing this to me? And I would say it out loud, and I get more lickings. Vitaline Elsie Jenner remembers strict patriarchal attitudes towards gender and sexuality, and instilled a sense of shame in girls growing up in residential schools. They never explain anything like you're developing into a woman and all that good stuff, which is nothing shameful about it. It's natural, but to me, I came out of there, and being shamed about everything. Everything was a shame based, lacking their culture's traditional knowledge, and offered nothing in the way of sex education. This led to confusion for young girls who survived the residential schools. Marielle Mauricio remembers, I didn't know what was going on because they never told us. All they did was mark the calendar and give you a piece of rag that was already stained. Dirty looking, huh? We had to use that, but I didn't even know what was happening with me. Looking on to Jesus. Wow, they used the religion as a weapon. Young and alone, many survivors had difficulty coping with their emotions, as Josiah Fiddler remembers. My first few weeks in school, I tried every day. Either it was on the beating of the seniors, the beatings, the pulling of the ears by the nuns, and my first introduction to the principal was a slap across the head and told me to get downstairs and join the other 100 boys there. After those first few weeks, I finally said, I'm not going to give them that satisfaction anymore. I stopped crying. And to this day, I haven't cried. I really can't. And I feel so good for people to have the ability to be able to cry because, as I said, I don't know how to cry. And those emotions, Antoinette White remembers, were even used to send message. I remember the one young fellow that hung himself in the gym, and they brought us in there and showed us as kids, and they just left him hanging there. And like, what was that supposed to teach us? You know, I'm 55 years old. I still remember that, and that's one thing out of all that school that I remember. It's sick. You know, my wife and daughter are Native, and, you know, I hear the stories of her grandparents. You know, Alan and Agnes Dick of Tishot First Nation, you know. They were strapped, that's in Port Alberni, BC. They were strapped to chairs and electrocuted for speaking their native language, which is Nuchaneth and Nootka. And, you know, and then her Auntie Ramona telling me the time when a priest kicked a 6-year-old girl down the stairs and killed her. You know, there's a lot of other stories I've heard driving my taxi from Native elders and Native people. Just disgusting stories like these, you know. You know, and it's pretty sad that, you know, people today, you know, say they're lying. So thousands of elders are lying about this stuff. The Canadian government is very corrupt, and it's disgusting. And I'm sorry that Native people went through this nonsense garbage.